She was holding her breath, not consciously, not with intention, but every 90 seconds, without fail, Victoria Chen's breathing would pause, a held exhale, a suspension of air, and then, 4 seconds later, the breath would release, and 30 seconds after that, the migraine would spike. The neurologist did not notice this. The headache specialist did not notice this. The functional medicine doctor did not notice this. 47 physicians over the course of 12 years had examined her brain, her blood work, her genetics, her lifestyle, her stress levels. They had found nothing wrong with her brain. What they had not done was watch her breathe. But James Porter had. James Porter had watched her breathe for approximately 8 seconds while he cleaned the conference room trash on a Tuesday morning, and in those 8 seconds he had seen something that $3 million in medical care had failed to see in 12 years. And everything that happened after that started with a question he asked quietly while emptying a bin beside her chair. "Miss Chen," he said, "are you aware that you hold your breath?" She did not answer him. She did not look at him. She did not acknowledge him in any way that would have suggested she had heard him, but her hands, which had been resting on the conference table in front of her, tightened slightly. Her fingernails pressed small crescents into her palm, and in that moment, James understood that she knew. She had always known. What she did not know was that the knowing was the entire problem. Victoria Chen was 34 years old and ran a venture capital firm that had turned $40 million in seed funding into a $4 billion portfolio in 8 years. She did not make emotional decisions. She did not make intuitive leaps. On pattern recognition, on a particular kind of cold clarity that had served her since she was 19 years old, sitting in a Harvard business classroom, understanding for the first time that the world rewarded people who could think without feeling. She had built her entire life on this principle. The migraines had started 12 years ago, not gradually, not with warning. They had arrived one Tuesday morning behind her right eye like a door slamming shut, and they had not stopped. Some days they were manageable, a pressure she could work through. Other days they were a physical thing, a presence in her skull that made thinking difficult, made speaking difficult, made existing in her own body a negotiation with something that did not want to negotiate. She had gone to 47 doctors. She had submitted to MRIs, Connecticut scans, PET scans, spinal taps, blood tests, genetic panels, sleep studies. She had been told it was genetic. Her mother had migraines. She had been told it was hormonal. It wasn't. She had been told it was stress, dietary, postural, environmental, neurological, vascular, and on one memorable Tuesday, that it was probably all in her head, which technically was accurate but not helpful. She had spent $3 million on this problem. She had spent more hours in medical offices than she had spent with her actual friends. She had become an expert on her own suffering in the way that chronic patients become experts, building encyclopedic knowledge of her own pain while remaining unable to change it. What she had not done was talk about what had caused it. What she had not done was acknowledge the Tuesday morning 12 years ago, when the migraines started, was the same Tuesday morning 12 years ago, when her mother had called to tell her that her father had been arrested, tax evasion, securities fraud, a 15-year federal investigation concluding. Everything he had built revealed to be built on a foundation of lies. She had hung up the phone. She had gone to work. She had sat in a conference room and made 3 presentations about market trends and portfolio rebalancing, and at the end of that day when she had tried to breathe, her body had simply stopped cooperating. It had not started again properly in 12 years. The morning James asked the question, Victoria had been in migraine for 47 hours straight. She had not slept. She had attempted to work, because that was what she did. But the pain had reached a level that made focusing feel like trying to read a document while someone was driving a nail through her temple. She had canceled the afternoon meetings. She had sat in the conference room with a glass of water she was not drinking and a phone she was not answering, waiting for the pain to break, which it would eventually, but not until it had extracted what it needed to extract. James entered at 9:47 in the morning. The cleaning crew came at 6 a.m. and again at 6 p.m., but James came alone at mid-morning to handle the trash in the executive spaces, the waste that accumulated between the scheduled services. He moved quietly. He was trained to move quietly. He had been a psychologist once, before his life had become a different kind of difficult. And in that life he had learned that the most important observations happened when people thought no one was watching. He noticed her first because she was there. The conference room was empty except for her. And he noticed her second because she was breathing wrong. It was not dramatic. It was not labored. Her breathing simply followed a pattern. 12 breaths per minute. Then a pause. A held exhale that lasted longer than a normal pause. Then the resumption. 12 breaths. Then the pause. The rhythm was metronome precise. It was also completely unconscious. Her eyes were closed. Her face was turned toward the window. She had no awareness that she was doing it. But James recognized the pattern. He had seen it before. He had seen it many times, in his old life, in the careful, controlled way that traumatized people learn to breathe. Not from technique, from survival, from a body that had learned, somewhere along the way, that breathing and safety were not compatible variables, and had solved the equation by stopping. He was emptying the trash near her chair when he asked the question, not to diagnose her, not to help her, not with any intention beyond the simple act of observation speaking itself into words. He asked because she deserved to know that she knew. James Porter was 41 years old and had spent the last 8 years learning how to want nothing. It was a skill like any other. It required practice. It required the particular kind of discipline that only develops after you have lost something so completely that wanting anything else feels like a betrayal of the loss itself. He had been a clinical psychologist. He had had a private practice in the city, in an office 2 blocks from where Victoria's venture firm now stood, though he did not go near that building anymore. He had had a colleague and a business partner named Richard Marks, and they had built a thriving practice together. Richard specialized in trauma. James specialized in breathing disorders and anxiety presentations. They had been friends for 12 years before they became partners. They had been partners for 3 years when everything ended. A patient had come to Richard's office in the spring of 2016, a woman in her late 20s, a researcher, speaking clearly about a childhood abuse situation that had resulted in PTSD and a specific cluster of anxiety presentations. Richard had done what he was trained to do. He had listened, he had documented, he had begun treatment. 3 months into treatment, the woman had become convinced that Richard was in love with her. James knew this because she had told him when she reached out to request a transfer to his care. She had been crying, she had felt rejected and confused, and she wanted to continue treatment somewhere safe. James had done the ethical thing. He had referred her to another practice. He had told Richard what had happened, and Richard had assured him it was a common transference issue and that he was handling it appropriately. 2 weeks later, the woman had filed a complaint with the licensing board. She alleged that Richard had touched her inappropriately during a session, that he had made statements suggesting that her progress in treatment was tied to her willingness to maintain a personal relationship with him, that he had implied she would lose his care if she did not comply. Richard denied it. He said it was a false accusation. He said she was unstable and this was part of her symptom presentation. He said James should believe him because James knew him, knew who he was, knew he would never do such a thing. The investigation took 4 months. During the investigation, 3 more patients came forward with similar allegations. Different incidents, different details, consistent pattern. The licensing board found that there was sufficient evidence to move forward with a formal hearing. But before the hearing could occur, Richard withdrew his license. He moved to another state. And the board, in its administrative efficiency, moved on to other cases. What the board did not move past was James. Because James had been Richard's partner. Because James had been the person Richard reported to. Because the perception of the board, never explicitly stated but perfectly clear in every interaction, was that James should have known, should have seen something, should have prevented it. The patients who had liked James, who had felt safe with him, transferred to other therapists. The referral network that had fed his practice for 12 years began to contract. The hospital where he did consultation work sent him a carefully worded letter suggesting that his services would no longer be needed. Within 6 months, his practice had effectively ceased to exist. Not through formal action, through the subtle, unstoppable social mathematics of reputation damage. He had tried to fight it. He had tried to explain his role, his lack of knowledge, his immediate action when he learned the truth. But the narrative had already crystallized. Therapist's partner sexually assaults patients. Therapist's business partner should have known. Therefore, therapist cannot be trusted. It did not matter that he had not known. It did not matter that he had referred the patient elsewhere. It did not matter that he had reported Richard immediately upon learning what had happened. The stain remained. He had lost his license, not officially, voluntarily. He had surrendered it during a conversation with the board investigator who had suggested that if he did not, the investigation into his own conduct would be substantially more aggressive. He understood what that meant. He understood he would spend $200,000 on legal fees defending himself against allegations that had no evidence, and he would still lose, and the loss would be slower and more painful. So he chose the faster loss. He surrendered his license, he closed his practice, he sold his office furniture at an auction, and he became a janitor, because janitorial work did not require credentials, and because the work was clean and repetitive and allowed his brain to exist in a space where no one expected him to be responsible for the internal states of other human beings. That had been 8 years ago. He had been good at being a janitor, meticulous, reliable, someone who noticed details and corrected small problems before they became large ones. The cleaning company had offered him a supervisory position twice. He had declined both times. Supervision meant responsibility. Responsibility meant the possibility of being blamed for failures he had not caused. He had enough of that. He had learned in the way that falsely accused people learn, that the safest position was one where your success or failure depended only on yourself. He cleaned Victoria's office building because the pay was steady and the hours were flexible and the building was beautiful in a way that he appreciated. The glass and steel and careful architecture, the way the light moved through it at different times of day. He did not interact with the people who worked there. He came when they were not present. He moved through the spaces they occupied and tried not to think about the fact that he had once occupied similar spaces and tried not to want any of it back. Until the morning he saw her holding her breath. Victoria heard his question. She did not respond to it, but she heard it. The question moved through her suspended state of pain and landed in a place that was not quite conscious but was aware enough to register impact. She did not open her eyes. She did not move. She did not do anything that would have suggested acknowledgement. But after James had emptied the trash and left the conference room, she sat in the silence and did something she had not done in a very long time. She paid attention to her breath. In, out, 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 in, out. Pause. The pause came. A held exhale, a moment where her lungs were empty and her body was still and everything felt suspended. She counted the seconds. 4, 5, 6. The pause released, breath returned, and then, as reliable as a clock mechanism, the migraines spiked. Not dramatically, just a sharpening. A tightening at the base of her skull, a reminder that her body was no longer her own. She had been holding her breath like that for 12 years. Unconsciously, reliably, every 90 seconds. A pattern so deeply embedded that her nervous system had built itself around it. Her body had learned to expect pain after the pause, so the pause itself had begun to trigger the anticipation of pain, which triggered more tension, which made the pain worse, which made the breathing shallower, which required more pauses to compensate. She had created a biological loop. And she had been caught in it for 12 years. She did not seek him out immediately. That was not her way. She spent 3 days researching breathing disorders. She read studies about hyperventilation syndrome. She read about psychogenic pain disorders. She read about trauma-related breathing patterns, though she did not label what she was reading as relevant to herself. She was just reading. Just gathering data. Just doing research the way she had always done research. On the 4th day, she found a name in an old article. James Porter. A clinical psychologist who had published 2 papers on breathing and anxiety in 2012 and 2013. Papers that were no longer cited in the current literature. An author whose work had apparently disappeared from the field. She had her IT director search for him. It took 12 hours. James Porter, 41, formerly licensed psychologist, currently employed as a cleaning services contractor, working for Sunrise Facilities Management, assigned to the Sentinel building downtown. Multiple failed background checks for employment during the years 2016 to 2020. 1 unexplained resignation from a medical consulting position. Victoria sat at her desk and read the sparse information, and she understood, in the way that intelligent people understand things that are not explicitly stated, that something had happened to him, something that had removed him from his profession, and that whatever had happened he still knew more about breathing and trauma than the 47 doctors she had seen in 12 years. She had her assistant call Sunrise Facilities. She had her assistant request James Porter specifically for the deep clean service the following Tuesday. She did not indicate what she wanted from him. She simply created the conditions for them to be in the same space again. He arrived at 6:15 in the evening, when most of the building had emptied. He had a crew of 2 other people, and they moved through the spaces with the efficiency of people who had done this many times. He did not acknowledge her. She was sitting at her desk, ostensibly working but actually waiting for the moment when he would come to empty her trash. He did. He came to her office at 6:47 p.m., and he did the work he was trained to do, and he did not look at her or speak to her until she spoke first. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she asked. He paused. His hand was inside the trash bin. He did not pull it out immediately. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yes, I want to know what you meant." He extracted his hand from the trash. He tied the bag. He did not look at her. "I meant that you are holding your breath," he said, "and I meant that you probably already know that." "I do know that," she said. "I have known that, but I don't know how to stop." He looked at her then. It was a careful look, not clinical, not the look of someone about to diagnose her. The look of someone who had learned, over years of working as a therapist, that acknowledgement itself was sometimes the most important part of the work. "That's not actually the first thing to do," he said. "The first thing is to understand why you started." She hired him privately. Not as a doctor, she was careful about that. As a consultant, a breathing specialist, someone who could advise her on a pattern she had developed. They met in a small apartment she kept for work meetings, a place separate from her office and her home, a neutral space where she could have conversations that needed containment. The first session she told him nothing. He asked her questions. When did the breathing pattern start? Did it coincide with any specific event? Was she aware of anxiety at the time? Did she remember what she was feeling? She answered the questions with data, facts, timeline, nothing emotional. She described the onset of her father's legal troubles as though reading from a case file. She described the federal investigation as though narrating a movie plot. She described the public revelation of his crimes, the news coverage, the photographs of him being led into the courthouse, the way the family had fractured afterward, as though these were externalities. Things that had happened to her, not things that had changed her. He did not interrupt. He let her get to the end of the story. Then he said, "That's the data. What were you feeling?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at the window of the small apartment. It faced a side street. Quiet. Unremarkable. "I didn't let myself feel anything," she said finally. Feeling would have meant stopping. And I couldn't stop. I had to keep working. I had to keep functioning. I had to show everyone that I was fine. "So you decided not to feel?" "I decided not to feel," she confirmed. "And your body decided that holding its breath was a way to help with that?" Breath holding is what happens when we suppress emotions. It's a physiological response. Your nervous system was trying to contain something too big to contain. She thought about that. "For 12 years? For 12 years, he said. "Your body has been working very hard to keep something from breaking open." The second session, he taught her to breathe. Not just to breathe normally, but to breathe with intention. To notice the difference between breathing that was protective and breathing that was simply air moving in and out. He taught her about the vagus nerve, about parasympathetic activation, about the way that certain breathing patterns could tell your nervous system that it was safe. He walked her through a coherence technique, a 5-count inhale, a 5-count exhale, no pause, just steady rhythmic breath. She did this for 10 minutes, and for the first time in 12 years she did not have a migraine. The absence of pain was so notable that she almost couldn't process it. Her mind kept expecting the spike that always came, but it did not come. "What did you just do?" she asked. "I changed your breathing pattern," he said. "Your migraines were being triggered by the breathing hold. Remove the breathing hold, and there's nothing to trigger them." "It can't be that simple." "It's never that simple," he said. "You have 12 years of neural pathways that expect pain. You have memory. You have anticipation. You have the feeling underneath all of that that you don't deserve to feel good. Because if you feel good, that means you're over it. That means it didn't matter. That means you've forgiven your father, or accepted his actions, or moved on from the fact that the man you thought he was turned out to be someone completely different." She felt something shift in her chest. A tightness, a warning, the beginning of the breath hold. She resisted it. She stayed present to the breathing pattern he had taught her, and the tightness eventually released. The third session he asked her about her father, not his crimes, her relationship with him, what she had felt when she learned what he had done. She said, "I felt like I had been living my entire life with a person I didn't know." He said, "What did you feel for him?" She said, "Rage, betrayal, grief, loss, the feeling that my entire childhood was a lie, the feeling that everything I had built on the foundation of who I thought he was now built on nothing." He said, "And you have not felt those things since?" It was not a question. She said, "No. I have not let myself feel those things." He said, "What would happen if you did?" She did not answer, but in the silence, something began to change. Some small thing that had been locked away in the frozen space beneath her lungs began to thaw. It was terrifying. It felt like the beginning of something that could not be stopped once it started. It felt like grief. Which, after 12 years, it was. The fourth session, she cried. Not delicately, not with control. She sat in the small apartment, and she cried in the way that people cry when they have been holding everything down for a very long time and suddenly realize they don't have to anymore. Her father was in federal prison. He would be in federal prison for 8 more years. She would not see him before then. She might not see him after. The man she had loved and believed in had been someone else, someone who had made choices that had stolen something from her family, from the people he had defrauded. And none of that would change if she felt it, but all of that would change her. James sat across from her and did not try to comfort her. He just sat with her in the space of her grief. And when she had cried herself out, when she had reached the bottom of the particular well that she had been carrying, he handed her a box of tissues and he said, "Your body knows how to heal. You just need to stop telling it not to." The 5th session, she noticed something. She was getting fewer migraines, 2 a week instead of 5, 6 a day instead of 12. Her breathing was changing. She could feel it. The held exhale was less frequent. Her baseline anxiety had dropped. She was sleeping better. She was in a way that was almost unnoticeable, feeling like herself again, or maybe for the first time feeling like the self that had been waiting underneath the person she had become when she decided that feeling was dangerous. "I need you to stop seeing me," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because this isn't real," she said. "You're a janitor. You don't have a license. If anyone finds out I'm having sessions with someone without credentials, it could damage my reputation, and more than that, it could damage yours. You've already lost your career once. I'm not going to be responsible for you losing it again." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you looked into my background?" "Yes," she said. "I researched you. I know what happened. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know something happened that made you leave your profession, and I'm not going to be the reason it happens again." "You looked into my background, but you didn't ask me about it," he said. "You just assumed. Tell me I'm wrong then." He was quiet. She waited. He said, "I'm not a janitor because I'm running from something. I'm a janitor because I didn't know how to stay in a profession where I might be blamed for things I didn't do. I'm a janitor because it's clean work and no one depends on me for their mental health." I'm a janitor because it's the safest place I could find. That's running, she said. Yes, he agreed. It is. She stood. She walked to the window. I can't keep seeing you. Even though you're helping me more than 47 doctors did, I can't keep doing this because it's not sustainable. And at some point we both need to be sustainable. You need to be sustainable. You're not sustainable as a janitor, working for a cleaning service, charging me in cash for sessions and rented apartments, and you're concerned about my sustainability. Yes, she said, I am. Why would you be concerned about someone you've just met? She turned back to him. Because you asked me if I was holding my breath, when no one else had bothered to watch. And that matters. What you did mattered. And I'm not going to watch you disappear again because you're afraid of what happened last time. Victoria returned to her normal life. She did not have another migraine in 14 days. The breathing pattern had changed. Her body had learned that it was safe again. She slept better. She worked better. She was in every measurable way healed. But she spent the 14 days thinking about James Porter. She spent them researching his case, not the public record. There was almost nothing public. She spent them making phone calls, to the licensing board, to people who had worked with him, to the hospital that had dropped him as a consultant. She built a picture, piece by piece, of what had happened. The accusation, the investigation, the way that Richard Marks had disappeared, but James had not been exonerated. The way that his reputation had been damaged by association. The way that the system had chosen to sacrifice him rather than question why a therapist's private choices might not be the responsibility of his business partner. She brought in her lawyers, not to sue anyone, but to investigate. To review the board's file. To examine the complaint process. To determine, definitively, whether James Porter had had any way of knowing what Richard Marks was doing, or whether he had been sacrificed as a convenient answer to a complicated problem. The answer was clear. James Porter had done nothing wrong. He had reported the patient's concerns to the appropriate person. He had recommended a transfer to another provider. He had acted with integrity at every step. And he had lost his career because he had happened to be the partner of someone who had acted without integrity. The board investigator who had suggested he surrender his license was named Margaret Reeves. She was still with the board. Victoria sat across from her in a formal meeting and said, James Porter was investigated in conjunction with allegations against Richard Marks, but the allegations were not directed at him. He had no knowledge of the misconduct. He took appropriate action when the information was disclosed. And he was told that surrendering his license would be easier than fighting the investigation. Margaret Reeves said, that's not accurate. Victoria said, I have the file, I have the documentation, I have the testimony of the patient who came forward, I have the testimony of the hospital that he was consulting with. He never acted inappropriately. He was sacrificed because he was convenient. Margaret Reeves's expression did not change. Dr. Porter chose to surrender his license. Dr. Porter was threatened into surrendering his license, Victoria said. I have your communication on record where you suggested that the investigation would be more aggressive if he did not. That's coercion. Margaret Reeves leaned back in her chair. What is it that you want? I want his license restored, Victoria said. I want an official statement from the board acknowledging that the investigation found no wrongdoing on his part. And I want it in writing. I can't do that, Margaret Reeves said. That would open the board to liability. If we acknowledge that we suggested he surrender his license inappropriately, we would be exposed to a legal claim. You're already exposed, Victoria said. The difference is whether we sue the board, or whether the board makes this right before we have to. Margaret Reeves understood what was happening. She understood that Victoria had the resources and the will to pursue this and that she would win. Not necessarily in court, but in the media, in the professional communities that the board had to work with, in the political pressure that could be brought to bear by someone with Victoria's access and her leverage. She said, give me a week. It took 8 days. The board issued a formal statement. The investigation into James Porter had found no evidence of wrongdoing. The suggestion that he surrender his license had been made in error. They regretted the impact that had had on his career. They would not be reinstating his license. That would require his application and his agreement. But they would be issuing a letter indicating that there were no barriers to his reapplication. Victoria delivered the letter to him in the small apartment where they had had their last session. He read it 3 times. His hands were shaking. You did this, he said. The board did this, she said. I just reminded them that they had done it wrong. You did this, he repeated. You investigated my case. You pressured the board. You spent resources and time and your own political capital on someone you'd known for 1 week. I spent my resources because you saved my life, she said. Not dramatically, not in a way that would get written about in the news, but you looked at me, and you saw that I was holding my breath, and you said something that 47 other doctors had not said, and that changed everything. That was worth investigating. You were worth investigating. He set the letter down. I can't go back to private practice, he said. I spent 8 years away. I spent those years learning how to not be responsible for other people's mental health. I don't think I can carry that again. Then don't, she said. Do something else. Teach, consult, research, write. There are ways to use what you know without returning to the profession exactly as it was. And what about you? He asked. I'm hiring you, she said, as a consultant to my firm. Not a therapist, a breathing and trauma consultant. Someone who works with executives on nervous system regulation. Someone who understands what happens when success becomes a shield for survival. I'll pay you 6 figures a year, full benefits, flexible schedule. He looked at her. Why would you do that? Because what you know matters, she said, and because I'm tired of powerful people ignoring the things that matter just because they don't fit into a spreadsheet. You fixed my migraines, not with a drug, not with a procedure. With information about my own breath. That's a valuable service, and you deserve to be paid for it. James accepted the position. He applied to have his license reinstated. The process took 4 months. In those 4 months, he worked with Victoria's team, developing a program on nervous system regulation, teaching executives about the connection between breath and emotional regulation, helping people understand the way that stress lived in the body. The applications for the program exceeded expectations. By the time his license was officially reinstated, Victoria had offered him the position of Director of Wellness and Psychological Consultation for her firm. Not as a janitor, not as a cleaner, as a professional. Someone with expertise and credentials and the authority that both of those things provided. He accepted. The announcement was not made publicly. It was not that kind of story. But the people who worked with him knew what had happened. They knew that the woman who ran the firm had been seeing him privately, that his presence in the building had changed her, that she was different, calmer, more present, more willing to be human in a space where humanity was often seen as weakness, and they saw in her something that had been missing before, not just the absence of migraines, the presence of something, a groundedness, a willingness to feel, a capacity to lead from a place of integration rather than from a place of armor. 6 months after James was hired, he was in a meeting with Victoria and the firm's partners. They were discussing expansion, new funds, new market sectors, new risk profiles, and Victoria said something that none of the partners had heard her say before. I'm not sure about this, she said. I think the expansion is moving too fast. I think we should wait. In the old Victoria, the one from before, that statement would never have been made. The analysis would have supported the expansion, and she would have gone forward with it, not because it was right, but because it was logical, and she had learned early that logic was safer than intuition. But she was different now. She had learned that breath held was different from breath withheld. She had learned that the difference between thinking and feeling was not the wall she had thought it was. She had learned that her body had wisdom that her mind did not always access. The partners went forward with a more conservative approach. And 3 months later, when the market shifted, the more conservative approach turned out to have been right. On a Tuesday evening 8 months after James had been hired, Victoria was in the office by herself, finishing some work, when she realized that James was still in the building. She found him in the small meditation room they had created for the wellness program, sitting quietly, looking out the window at the city lights. I wanted to thank you, she said, for what you did, for seeing something that no one else saw. He looked at her. You did more for me than I did for you. No, she said. You did something that couldn't be undone. You broke the pattern. You made me ask a question I had been running from for 12 years. And the answer to that question changed everything. They were quiet for a moment. The city was bright below them, full of people trying not to feel. Full of people holding their breath, full of people whose nervous systems had learned to protect them in ways that no longer served them but that had become so habitual that changing them felt impossible. Do you think it's possible, Victoria said, to help people the way you helped me? Not as a therapist, but as someone who just watches and sees and says the thing that breaks the silence? Yes, James said. I think that's possible. Then maybe we expand the program, she said. Not just for our firm, for other companies, other people. Maybe you teach people how to see the things that doctors miss, the way you saw me. He considered this. I would need to go back to school, he said, to do it properly, to have the credentials to back it up. So go back to school, Victoria said. We'll pay for it. You can do it while you work. The firm will support it. He looked at her. For a moment his expression shifted. For a moment, the carefully controlled facade dropped, and what appeared underneath was something like hope. Something like the beginning of a belief that the life he had lost was not the only life he could have, that there was a version of the future that was not just a survival but something more. One condition, he said. What? No romanticism, he said. This isn't a story where we end up together. She smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. No, she agreed. It's not a story where we end up together. It's a story where we end up here, in this building, working with people who are holding their breath. And we help them breathe again. That's the ending. That's the ending, he repeated. And it was. James Porter is now a licensed clinical psychologist again. He got his doctorate. He published a paper on psychogenic pain and breathing patterns that is being used in medical schools. He teaches a course on trauma and the body. Victoria Chen expanded her firm into the executive wellness space. The program James developed is now used by 4 Fortune 500 companies and over 200 private firms. They do not date. They do not have a romantic relationship. But they work together. And in that work, both of them found something that had been lost, a sense of purpose, a sense of competence, a sense that the part of their lives that had ended was not the entirety of their lives. Victoria's father will be released from federal prison in 4 years. She is not sure if she will see him. She is sure that when she does, or does not, she will be able to breathe through it. James sometimes cleans the conference rooms himself, on days when he is not consulting, not because he has to, because he remembers the person he was when he could move through a space unnoticed, and he values that memory. He remembers Victoria, holding her breath, not knowing that the very thing she was doing to protect herself was the thing that was killing her. And he remembers that sometimes saving someone does not require credentials, it requires attention, it requires the willingness to watch. It requires a simple question asked quietly, are you aware that you are holding your breath? And sometimes, the answer to that question changes everything.